I don't even know where to begin. 7 years of marriage. We've got 2 beautiful kids, a mortgage, and a lot of shared memories, but lately, it's like we're strangers living under the same roof. It all started about 6 months ago. Things between me and Laura, my wife, began to feel off. We'd been arguing more, sure, but that wasn't unusual. What was strange was how distant she became. You know that feeling when someone's physically present, but they might as well be 1,000 miles away? That was us. I kept brushing it off. I thought maybe it was work stress, or maybe the kids were getting to her. God knows, we've both been overwhelmed trying to balance everything. But then it hit me that this wasn't just a rough patch. There was something deeper going on. I tried talking to her about it, and that's when I realized how slippery she could be. Every time I brought up how we weren't connecting anymore, she'd turn it around on me, tell me I was being paranoid, that everything was fine. And damn, she's good at that. Laura has this way of making me feel like I'm the crazy one, like maybe I'm just imagining it all. That's when I decided to do something about it. I suggested we see a psychologist, to work on the marriage. She was hesitant at first, acted like it was unnecessary, but I convinced her. We needed help, and I wasn't ready to give up on our family. So, we started seeing Dr. Richard Evans. He seemed like a good guy, someone we could trust. We did joint sessions at first, and I honestly thought things were getting better. But then he suggested individual sessions, and that's when things started to feel weird. I didn't think much of it at first. It made sense, right? Sometimes, you need to work on yourself before you can fix the relationship. But after Laura's solo sessions with Dr. Evans, she came back different. More distant. After Laura started seeing Dr. Evans alone, something shifted. She wasn't just distant anymore, she was completely disconnected. She'd come back from her sessions, and it was like she was mentally checked out. I'd ask her how it went, and she'd give me these vague answers like, "Oh, it was fine," or "We just talked about stress." But nothing concrete. It was weird. I mean, if the whole point of therapy was to help us, shouldn't we be talking about it? I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just part of the process. But as the weeks went by, the tension in our house became unbearable. She stopped initiating conversations, let alone anything physical between us. I couldn't remember the last time we were intimate. It was like she'd built this wall around herself, and I was on the outside, pounding on it, trying to break through. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I tried to have a serious conversation with her. I told her I felt like we were drifting apart, like I didn't even know who she was anymore. She just stared at me, almost bored, like the words I was saying didn't even register. "You're being dramatic, Mike," she said, her voice cold, detached. "Not everything is about you." It stung. I didn't even recognize her anymore. This wasn't the woman I married. The Laura I fell in love with was warm, passionate, even fiery at times. But now? It was like she didn't care at all. To make matters worse, she started staying late at work more often. She'd claim it was because of deadlines, or that she had to meet with colleagues, but something didn't sit right with me. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but every time I asked her about it, she'd snap back with a sharp, "You're overthinking it. Stop being so insecure." I started to feel paranoid, like I was losing my mind. The kids were noticing the tension too. Our oldest, Emma, even asked me if Mommy was mad at us. That broke me. I didn't have the heart to tell her that I didn't know what was going on with her mom. I was just as lost. The worst part? I was still holding on to the hope that this was just a phase, that maybe, after a few more therapy sessions, we'd find our way back to each other. But deep down, something was gnawing at me, telling me that Laura wasn't being honest. Something was off. I just didn't know how bad it really was yet. Things only got worse after that night. Laura's late nights at work became more frequent, and I could feel myself spiraling into this constant state of suspicion. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who checks his wife's phone or questions her every move, but it was hard not to when every sign pointed to something being seriously wrong. I started noticing the little things. She'd come home smelling like perfume, but it wasn't hers. She'd get texts late at night and flip her phone over before I could see who it was. Once, when her phone buzzed and I instinctively glanced at it, she snatched it up so fast you'd think I caught her with some kind of secret. When I asked who it was, she barely looked at me and said, "Work. Nothing you need to worry about." That was her favorite line lately, nothing you need to worry about. But how could I not? I knew something was happening behind the scenes, but I didn't have proof, and every time I tried to bring it up, she made me feel like I was imagining things. Meanwhile, our sessions with Dr. Evans continued, though they felt more pointless by the week. In our joint sessions, Laura barely participated. She'd sit there with her arms crossed, occasionally glancing at her watch, like she couldn't wait to get out of there. Dr. Evans would ask her how she was feeling, and she'd just give these short, dismissive answers, while I sat there pouring my heart out, trying to figure out how we got so far off track. The strangest part was how protective Dr. Evans seemed of her. Every time I'd bring up my concerns, about her staying late at work, about how we weren't communicating, he'd subtly redirect the conversation. He'd focus on me, asking if maybe my own anxieties were clouding my judgment or if I was putting too much pressure on Laura during an already stressful time. At first, I trusted him. I mean, he was supposed to be the expert, right? He was the one helping us, so maybe I was the one overreacting. Maybe I needed to take a step back and let Laura work through whatever she was dealing with. But the more I thought about it, the more things just didn't add up. The turning point came during one of Laura's individual sessions. She'd been gone for hours, way longer than any normal session should take. When she finally got home, she had this weird energy about her, almost like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have. I asked her if everything was okay, and she snapped at me, telling me to stop being so clingy, that I needed to back off and give her space. It was in that moment I realized I wasn't just being paranoid. There was something going on between Laura and Dr. Evans, something that went way beyond therapy. But I still didn't have any proof. Just this sinking feeling in my gut that kept getting stronger with every passing day. I was starting to question everything. Was the whole therapy thing just an excuse? Had I unknowingly hired the person who was slowly destroying my marriage? It felt like a cruel joke, but I wasn't ready to confront her, yet. Not without knowing for sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, but I still didn't have any solid proof. My mind was constantly racing, trying to connect the dots between Laura's behavior, the late nights, and Dr. Evans. I kept telling myself that I was jumping to conclusions, but the more I thought about it, the more the signs pointed to something I couldn't ignore. One evening, after Laura came home late again, I decided to check her phone. I know, it wasn't the right thing to do, but at that point, I needed answers. I waited until she was in the shower, and I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. She didn't even bother to change her passcode. I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. I went through her messages first, but there was nothing. No suspicious conversations, no incriminating texts. But something felt off. Laura had always been a bit secretive with her phone, but now it was almost like she was too careful. I checked her call log, same story, nothing unusual. But then I noticed something in her browsing history. There were frequent visits to an email account I didn't recognize. It wasn't her regular work email or personal one. This was something different. I didn't have the password to that email, but it was clear she'd been using it recently. My heart started racing. It was like I'd uncovered a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what the whole picture looked like. The next day, I decided to confront Dr. Evans, not directly, but in a way that would give me some insight into what was really going on. We had another joint session scheduled, and I figured it was the perfect opportunity to test the waters. During the session, I brought up how distant Laura had been. I tried to be as open as possible, talking about how disconnected I felt and how it was affecting our marriage. Laura, as usual, said very little, just nodding and offering brief responses. But Dr. Evans? He seemed defensive. Almost like he was protecting her, not just as a patient, but on a personal level. I think it's important to give Laura the space she needs to process everything, Dr. Evans said, his voice calm but firm. Sometimes, in relationships, one partner can feel overwhelmed, and the best thing we can do is offer support without putting pressure on them. That's when I asked him, point blank, do you think she's hiding something from me? The room went dead silent. Laura shot me a glare, and Dr. Evans shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. After a long pause, he said, "It's not about hiding, Mike. It's about feeling safe enough to share. Maybe Laura doesn't feel like she can open up to you right now." His words hung in the air, and I could feel my blood boiling. He was deflecting, and I knew it. They were both keeping something from me, and I was done playing along. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured them together, Laura and Dr. Evans. Was I imagining things? Was I really going crazy? Or was my gut telling me the truth all along? I needed more than just a hunch. I needed proof, but I still didn't know how far I was willing to go to get it. After that session, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played. Every word Dr. Evans said seemed rehearsed, almost like he was guiding me away from the truth instead of helping us deal with it. Laura, on the other hand, had mastered the art of avoidance. Any time I tried to bring up what I was feeling, she'd shut it down, deflect, or simply walk away. I knew I had to dig deeper. I started paying closer attention to her behavior. It was the small things that started to stand out, her sudden need for privacy, her reluctance to talk about her solo sessions with Dr. Evans, and how she always seemed to have her phone glued to her hand when she thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I was picking up on patterns, and it was driving me insane. One afternoon, while Laura was out, no surprise, she didn't even bother telling me where, I decided to take a bold step. I went to her computer, hoping to find something that would either confirm my worst fears or, God willing, put my mind at ease. I knew it was wrong. But at that point, I felt like I had no choice. My marriage, my sanity, they were on the line. I opened her laptop and there it was, the same strange email account that had been in her phone's browsing history. This time, I decided to take a leap and try to reset the password, hoping I could catch a clue. It worked. She must have been using an old security question, one I knew the answer to, her childhood pet's name. When the inbox opened, my stomach dropped. There were a handful of emails between Laura and Dr. Evans. But they weren't the clinical kind you'd expect between a psychologist and his patient. They were personal, flirtatious even. In one of them, she thanked him for helping her see things clearly, and for being there when no one else could be. In another, he responded, telling her how special she was and how their time together was a rare connection. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart pounding in my ears. I clicked on the most recent email, dated just a couple of days ago. It was from Laura to Dr. Evans, telling him how she couldn't wait for their next session and how much she looked forward to getting away from everything. She said she felt alive with him in a way she hadn't felt in years. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands trembling. It was happening. My worst fear was right there in black and white. I had hired this man to help fix our marriage, and instead, he was the one tearing it apart. And Laura? She had played along, knowing full well what was going on behind my back. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of our house, our home, the place where we built our life together. I felt numb. Everything was unraveling right in front of me, and the worst part. I still didn't know how to confront her. Or if I even wanted to. I wasn't ready to explode just yet. I needed a plan, and I needed to see how deep this betrayal went before I made my next move. After finding those emails, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I knew Laura was betraying me, but I wasn't sure how far it had gone. Was this just some emotional affair that spiraled out of control, or had it crossed every line imaginable? I was furious, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't ready to confront her until I had every piece of the puzzle. That night, I pretended everything was normal. I'm not sure how I pulled it off, how I sat across from her at dinner, hearing the kids laugh about their day, and just nodded along like my whole world wasn't crumbling. Laura, as usual, acted like nothing was wrong. She was good at that. A professional liar, really. It's terrifying how convincing someone can be when they've perfected the art of deception. But now I had seen the cracks in her facade, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The next few days, I kept playing the part of the clueless husband. I didn't let on that I knew anything. Instead, I observed, watched her even more closely, waiting for her next move. I started noticing that she was going out more frequently, and when I asked, her excuses were so vague, just running errands, or meeting up with friends. It was always something that left her just enough room to cover her tracks, but now I knew better. I decided to dig deeper. I called in sick to work one day, without telling Laura, and waited to see where she went. She left the house in the early afternoon, saying she had another therapy session with Dr. Evans. I watched her drive away and, for a second, considered confronting her right then and there. But I didn't. I needed to know exactly what was happening before I let all my emotions explode. I followed her, discreetly, of course, keeping my distance so she wouldn't notice. Sure enough, she wasn't heading to Dr. Evans' office. My heart raced as I tailed her down a series of streets, my grip tight on the steering wheel. She eventually pulled into a parking lot behind a small hotel just outside of town. My stomach sank. I parked far enough away to stay out of sight but close enough to see her get out of the car. She walked into the hotel, checking over her shoulder as if she knew she was doing something wrong. I couldn't bring myself to follow her inside, I was too stunned, too sick to my core to move. I sat there, staring at the hotel door she'd disappeared behind, my mind racing. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just some emotional connection. She was meeting him, meeting Dr. Evans. I knew it. I waited. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, after what must have been over an hour, she emerged. And she wasn't alone. Dr. Evans walked out with her, laughing, his hand brushing her lower back. They lingered by the door for a moment, too close, too comfortable. He kissed her, right there in broad daylight, as if he didn't have a care in the world. I sat there in shock. My wife. The psychologist I trusted. Together. I couldn't believe it, but there it was, happening right in front of me. This wasn't just some misunderstanding or a rough patch in our marriage. This was a full-blown affair. I gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought I'd break it. All the anger, all the betrayal, it hit me like a wave. But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I snapped a few photos with my phone, capturing the two of them together, thinking I might need them later. And then I drove home, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I was done pretending. Done playing along with her lies. The next step was inevitable, a confrontation. But I had to be smart about it. I had to make sure there was no way for her to wriggle out of this one. The secret was out. Now it was just a matter of how I'd break it all apart. The drive home felt like a blur. My mind was racing with what I had just witnessed, Laura and Dr. Evans, out in the open, like they had nothing to hide. I kept playing it over in my head, trying to make sense of it, but no matter how many times I ran through the details, the betrayal hit just as hard every time. I knew I had to confront her. I couldn't hold it in anymore. That evening, Laura came home as if nothing had happened. She walked through the door, smiled at the kids, and greeted me with that same fake warmth she'd been using for months. It made me sick to my stomach knowing what she'd been doing just hours before. But I didn't want to explode in front of the kids. This was going to be between us. After dinner, when the kids were finally upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for her. I'd never felt anger like that before, but I knew I had to keep it together. Laura walked into the room, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. That was it, I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. She barely looked up. "About what?" she asked, casually, like we were about to discuss groceries or weekend plans. I stared at her for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't going to let her brush this off. I wasn't going to let her lie her way out of this one. "I know what's going on, Laura." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time in months, I saw a crack in her mask. A brief flash of panic. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a little too steady. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table in front of her. I swiped to the photos I'd taken earlier that day, the ones of her and Dr. Evans outside the hotel, kissing. Her face went pale. She didn't even bother reaching for the phone to see the pictures. She knew. "Mike, I can explain," she started, but I cut her off. "Explain what?" "How the psychologist I hired to save our marriage is sleeping with you. How you've been lying to my face for months." My voice was rising, but I didn't care. I'd held it in for too long. She stood there, frozen, not knowing what to say. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of it, but there was no way out this time. She was caught. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking. "I trusted him. And this is what you've been doing behind my back." She finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Mike. I never meant for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, so what? It just happened." I shook my head. "You think that makes it any better? You've been sneaking around with him, lying to me, lying to our kids. Was any of it real? Any of this? Or have you been pretending the whole time?" Laura's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just because she'd been caught. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. I was confused. I didn't know how to handle everything. "Confused?" I spat. "No, Laura, you knew exactly what you were doing. You made a choice. You chose him. And now, you've destroyed everything." She sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, I almost felt bad, but then the anger came flooding back. This wasn't just some mistake. This was betrayal on a level I never thought possible. "So, what now?" I asked, the words heavy in the air. "What happens next?" She looked up at me, her face a mess of guilt and fear. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I don't know what to do." I shook my head, my mind already made up. "Well, I do. I'm done, Laura. I can't do this anymore. I won't." The words hung between us, final and cold. There was no going back from this. She had made her choice, and now, I was making mine. A week passed since I confronted Laura, and things between us were hanging by a thread. She'd apologized countless times, told me she was confused, but every time she opened her mouth, all I heard were excuses. We were still under the same roof, still playing the part for the kids, but inside, I was barely holding it together. I didn't know what I wanted from her anymore. Answers. Closure. I'd already seen the truth. Still, something inside me needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. I wasn't ready to walk away without facing it head-on, no matter how much it hurt. Laura had an individual session scheduled with Dr. Evans the next afternoon. She didn't say much about it, just another vague mention of therapy, like she hadn't been sleeping with the guy who was supposed to be saving our marriage. But this time, I wasn't going to sit at home, wondering. I decided I was going to be there. Without telling Laura, I cleared my schedule and made up my mind. I was going to show up at that session. If she wasn't hiding anything, then a joint session shouldn't be a problem, right? But if she was... I drove to Dr. Evans' office with a pit in my stomach, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I got there, I walked into the building like I belonged there. No one even blinked as I made my way down the hallway toward his office. I could hear muffled voices as I approached, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever I might find. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. My heart pounded in my chest, and without thinking twice, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The scene that greeted me was worse than anything I'd imagined. There, on Dr. Evans' desk, was my wife, completely naked, her legs spread wide, making love to the man I'd hired to fix our marriage. Her moans filled the room, and they were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice I was standing there. For a second, the world stopped. Time froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Laura, my wife, the mother of my children, wasn't just cheating. She was in the middle of the most intimate act, in a place where we were supposed to be healing, with the man who was supposed to be helping us. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I slammed the door shut so hard it shook the walls. Laura's head snapped around, her eyes wide with horror. Dr. Evans jumped up, scrambling to cover himself, but it didn't matter. I'd already seen it all. Mike, Laura started, but I didn't stay to hear whatever excuse she had prepared this time. I turned and stormed down the hallway, fury and disgust boiling inside me. I barely remember getting to my car. I don't even know how I made it to the bar. All I know is that by the time I sat down at the counter, my hands were shaking, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. I ordered a drink, something strong, and stared blankly at the glass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. This was it. The final nail in the coffin. Whatever hope I had of salvaging our marriage was dead. I downed my drink and motioned for another. My mind kept replaying the image of Laura on that desk, the shock on her face when she realized she'd been caught. But the thing that stung the most was how they'd done it in his office. The same place where I'd bared my soul, where I'd trusted them both. It was sickening. As I sat there, drowning in whiskey and anger, one thought kept running through my mind: I had to get out. Out of this marriage, out of this lie I'd been living. Laura and Dr. Evans had destroyed everything we'd built, and there was no coming back from this. No more waiting, no more pretending. I was done. After hours at the bar, I was beyond drunk and beyond caring. I had downed more whiskey than I could count, each shot dulling the edges of my anger but never quite erasing the image of Laura and Dr. Evans tangled up in his office. It played in my mind like some twisted movie, and the more I drank, the more I realized just how far gone everything was. I wasn't thinking straight. Honestly, I wasn't thinking at all. That's when I met her, Kara. She was sitting at the bar, sipping a cocktail, her blonde hair falling over one shoulder. We started talking, and it didn't take long before the conversation turned flirty. I didn't care about anything anymore, least of all the moral high ground I'd been clinging to. I just wanted to feel something, anything that wasn't this betrayal festering inside me. When Kara smiled, I smiled back, and before I knew it, we were leaving the bar together, heading back to my place. The whole ride home, my heart was pounding, but not from nerves. No, this was revenge, plain and simple. I wanted to hurt Laura, the same way she had torn me apart. Maybe it was petty, maybe it was stupid, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing I had control over. We got to the house, and I led Kara inside, trying to stay quiet so the kids wouldn't wake up. The hallway was dark as we made our way upstairs. I could see the faint glow from under our bedroom door, where Laura was, sleeping peacefully like nothing had happened, like she wasn't out earlier that day screwing our marriage counselor. I opened the door to our bedroom and there she was, Laura, lying on our bed, the same bed we'd shared for 7 years, as if everything was perfectly normal. That sight filled me with rage. She was pretending. Pretending like she hadn't just blown up our lives, like she hadn't just ripped my heart out. Without saying a word, I marched over to the bed and grabbed the blankets, yanking them off her with one swift motion. Laura sat up, startled, blinking in confusion. "Mike, what the hell?" Before she could even finish, I cut her off. "Get out." She stared at me, wide-eyed, but I didn't give her a chance to argue. I said, "Get the hell out of this bed." Laura's eyes flicked to Kara, standing in the doorway, and then back to me. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Who is she?" I didn't answer. I didn't owe her any answers. Not after what she'd done. Instead, I turned to Kara and nodded toward the bed. "Come on in." Laura's face twisted in disbelief as Kara stepped into the room and slid into bed beside me, the sheets still warm from where Laura had been. "Mike, stop!" Laura cried, her voice cracking. "What are you doing?" But I didn't stop. I didn't even acknowledge her as I pulled Kara closer. Without another word, I kissed her, letting my hands roam as if Laura wasn't even there, still standing by the bed, frozen in shock. Kara responded, and in that moment, all my focus was on her, on feeling something other than betrayal, anger, and pain. Laura stood there, watching, as we started making love right in front of her. I didn't care that she was still in the room, didn't care about anything except the fact that I was done pretending to be the victim. This was my way of showing her exactly how far we'd fallen. How broken everything was. "Get out," I muttered again, barely pausing to look at her. "You've got no right to be here." Laura stood frozen for a second, disbelief and hurt etched across her face. She grabbed her clothes, her voice shaking with anger, but she didn't say another word. She just turned and walked out, leaving me and Kara alone in the wreckage of our marriage. As the door clicked shut behind her, I felt a bitter satisfaction settle in my chest. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one being humiliated. But as Kara and I lay there, tangled in each other, a heavy emptiness settled over me. Because even in that moment of revenge, deep down, I knew nothing would ever fix what Laura had broken. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a gnawing sense of regret. Kara was still asleep beside me, her arm draped across my chest, but I couldn't focus on her. My mind was spinning as I tried to piece together the mess I had made the night before. The room was quiet, but it felt suffocating. The events of the night came crashing down on me, bringing Kara home, throwing Laura out of bed, making love right in front of her. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't power. It was a moment of anger, of complete self-destruction, and now that the alcohol had worn off, the reality of it was starting to sink in. Kara stirred next to me, mumbling something as she rolled over. I quietly slid out of bed, not wanting to wake her. I needed to clear my head before I dealt with anything else. The house was silent, and for a moment, I wondered where Laura had gone after I threw her out. She wasn't in the guest room, and the kids were still asleep, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding around them. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my thoughts spiraling. How had I let things get this bad? Just a few days ago, I was still trying to save my marriage, still holding on to some hope that Laura and I could find our way back to each other. Now, there was nothing left. We were both beyond repair, and I knew it. As I sat there, the door to the kitchen creaked open, and Laura walked in. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She didn't look angry anymore, just exhausted. She stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at me like she was trying to find the right words, but neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she broke the silence. "What the hell happened to us, Mike?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. I looked at her, feeling the weight of the question settle over me. You happened, Laura. You and him. My voice was tired, defeated. You tore us apart. And I let it happen. She flinched at my words, her eyes filling with tears again, but I couldn't stop. What did you think was going to happen? That you could sleep with the man I trusted to save our marriage, and we'd just move on like nothing happened? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know how it got this far. I never meant. Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't say you didn't mean for this to happen. You knew exactly what you were doing. She sank into the chair across from me, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. I know I messed up, Mike. But what you did last night, bringing her here, in our bed. How could you? I shook my head, staring into my coffee. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I wasn't thinking at all. But you know what? It felt good, just for a moment, to take back some control. Laura's tears spilled over, but she didn't fight back. She didn't try to defend herself anymore. We both knew there was no point. We were standing in the ashes of our marriage, and there was nothing left to save. I'll file for divorce, I said, my voice flat. The words felt heavy, final. I'll find a lawyer. We'll figure out how to handle everything with the kids. She didn't argue. She just nodded, wiping at her eyes. Okay. We sat there for a while, the silence between us thick with everything that had gone wrong. There was no screaming, no dramatic fight. Just the quiet realization that it was over. I wasn't sure what was worse, the chaos or the calm. As I stood up to leave, Kara emerged from the bedroom, wearing nothing but a sheet wrapped around her. She looked at both of us, clearly sensing the tension. Hey, is everything okay? She asked, oblivious to the hurricane she'd walked into. I glanced at Laura, her eyes locked on the floor, before turning to Kara. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Everything's fine. But we all knew that wasn't true. Nothing was fine. Nothing would be fine for a long, long time. Filing for divorce was the hardest but most necessary decision I'd ever made. After the confrontation in the kitchen and everything that followed, there was no turning back. I couldn't keep pretending that there was anything left to salvage with Laura. The betrayal was too deep, and the damage was done. So, I called a lawyer and began the process of untangling the life we had built together. The kids, Emma and Jack, stayed with me. It wasn't easy, especially at first. They didn't know the full extent of what had happened between me and their mother, but they could sense the tension, the shift in our family. Laura had tried to fight for custody initially, but after weeks of back and forth, she eventually gave up. She knew the kids were better off with me. The truth was, she had lost their respect the moment everything came to light. Through it all, Kara was there. I didn't expect her to stick around after what happened that night, after I had dragged her into my storm of anger and chaos. But she stayed. I started to see her in a new light, not just as some woman I met at a bar in a moment of weakness, but as someone who genuinely cared. She became a constant presence in my life, and more importantly, in the kids' lives. At first, I was cautious about introducing Kara to Emma and Jack. I didn't want them to feel like I was replacing their mother or forcing someone new into their world. But Kara was patient. She didn't push. She just fit. Slowly, she became more than just someone I'd met. She became a friend to all of us. It amazed me how naturally she connected with the kids. Emma, with her artistic side, loved spending time with Kara, who encouraged her creativity, always bringing over new sketchbooks and paints. Jack, on the other hand, was more reserved, but Kara had this way of getting him to open up, playing video games with him and showing interest in all his little hobbies. It didn't take long before both of them were asking when Kara was coming over again, treating her like she'd always been a part of our family. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. After everything I had been through with Laura, I thought I'd be broken forever, stuck in this cycle of pain and anger. But Kara brought a kind of light back into my life, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about the romance, it was about the ease of being with someone who made things feel simple. She made me laugh again. She made the house feel warm again. At first, Laura hated the idea of Kara being around the kids. She tried to argue that it wasn't appropriate, that it was too soon. But the kids were happy. They weren't blind to what had happened, they knew their mother had been distant, knew things had fallen apart. So when Laura tried to fight me on it, the kids pushed back. They didn't want the tension. They wanted peace, too. Eventually, Laura gave in. She stopped fighting, stopped trying to control the narrative, and accepted that things had changed. The last few times she saw the kids, she barely put up any resistance. It was like she knew she had lost them, not just custody, but the connection. As time passed, Laura grew more distant. She was alone, and it was obvious. Her affair with Dr. Evans didn't last long after the divorce papers were filed. I don't know what happened between them, and honestly, I didn't care. She'd made her choices, and she was paying the price. Now, she was the one left in an empty house, while I was rebuilding my life with the kids and with Kara. And Kara? She was more than I ever could have hoped for. She filled the spaces Laura had left empty, not just for me but for the kids, too. The three of us were healing, and Kara was a big part of that. I could see it in the way Emma laughed again, in the way Jack smiled more. I could feel it in myself, too. The anger, the bitterness, it was fading. I felt good again, something I thought I'd never be able to say. Kara wasn't trying to replace Laura, and the kids didn't see her as a replacement either. She became a friend to them, someone they could trust and rely on. Over time, what started as a friendship between Kara and me blossomed into something deeper. It wasn't rushed or forced. It just happened. She was there when I needed her most, and she showed me that it was possible to love again, even after the worst kind of heartbreak. As for Laura, she was left to deal with the consequences of her choices. Alone. I thought I'd feel satisfaction in that, but in the end, I just felt nothing. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. I was moving on, building something new with Kara, and Laura was a distant memory, a chapter one had finally closed. For the first time in a long time, I was truly happy. We were happy. And that was all that mattered. The day I married Kara was nothing short of perfect. It wasn't a grand, flashy wedding like the one I had with Laura years ago, but it felt right. Intimate, simple, surrounded by close family and friends, most importantly, Emma and Jack were there, beaming with happiness as Kara and I exchanged vows. It was surreal how far we had come from the chaos and heartbreak that had nearly consumed me. Standing there, holding Kara's hands, I knew that I had found something real, something steady. She was everything I didn't know I needed. Life with Kara was different, easier, lighter. She brought warmth into every corner of our home. The kids adored her, and over time, it became clear that she was more than just a stepmom to them, she was family. We built new traditions together, and I could see the love growing between all of us. There were no secrets, no tension, just a deep sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in years. The scars from my past with Laura were still there, but with Kara, they didn't hurt as much. They became a reminder of how far I'd come, how much I had healed. Laura, on the other hand, had never really moved on. I heard bits and pieces from mutual friends, how she still lived alone, how she would ask about the kids, or how she would bring up our past when she'd had one too many drinks. She'd never been able to maintain a stable relationship after Dr. Evans, and it seemed like she was stuck in this loop, unable to let go of what we once had. There was a part of me that felt sorry for her, but I knew better than to let that sympathy turn into anything more. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Even though we rarely spoke, I could tell that Laura still thought about us, about the life we'd built and lost. She had tried reaching out a few times, under the guise of talking about the kids, but it was clear she wanted more. There were hints in her voice, small slips in the conversations, where she'd mention how good things used to be or how she regretted what happened. But I never indulged her. I had moved on, and there was no part of me that wanted to revisit the past we shared. It was over. Kara knew about these occasional calls, and she never let it bother her. She was secure in our relationship, and the kids were happy. We had built a life that was solid, unshakable. I often marveled at how everything had turned around, how a woman I met during one of the darkest moments of my life had become the one to guide me into the light. I loved Kara, and I couldn't imagine my life without her. As for Laura, she was left with her regrets, watching from the sidelines as I built a future she could no longer be part of. It wasn't the ending I had imagined when we first got married, but it was the one we both deserved. Laura couldn't forget me, but I had long since let her go, finding my peace and happiness in a life that felt whole again.